thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. We're going to talk about turning data into action today. It's great to follow the John Deere guys because they were talking about how to actually apply products out in the field. And I'm kind of the guy behind the scenes, sort of taking that data and turning it into something, whether that's turning it into a prescription, soil sampling zones, or something that you can use, making decisions off of it. So let's just dive into it. Now, this presentation might feel a little bit random because we're going to go through a lot of different aspects that you can do with data, but we'll go with it from there. So a little bit about the company that I work for, GK Technology. We are actually a very old precision agriculture company, believe it or not. When you open up our software package, ADMS, the copyright on it is actually 1996. So if you think about when GPS was actually starting to go on tractors, that's kind of at the very forefront of what's going on. And actually the original owner of the company, Darren Johnson, who actually is a self-taught computer programmer, but has a background in managing egg retail agronomy locations. He actually did write prescriptions for fertilizer applicators before there was actually GPS on tractors. Yeah, I'm not making that up. He had it figured out for the width of the boom and how fast the fertilizer spreader would drive across the field. And so based on that information, he could write a VRT prescription. So it's very interesting. We're a very small company, only 8 employees. And my background, again, is really focused around agronomy and then how I actually digitize that. So we're going to talk about turning data into action. What kind of action are we talking about? Well, of course, we have to say go bison. But this is not the action that we're talking about today. We are, in fact, talking about agronomy and precision agriculture data. And I kind of divided this out into 3 separate things. Variable rate applications and prescriptions, decision aids. So, how can we use our data to really make good decisions? And also drainage. We make an awful lot of surface drainage maps, and we make an awful lot of drain tile plans in our company as well. So number 1, the first thing you have to do is understand the variability in your field. If you're going to write a variable rate prescription, there has to be a reason why. So where is the variability in your field actually occurring? Well, there's different ways that we can partition that out. You can use grids and grid sample. You can use zones and topography data as well, which is especially important when you're working with drainage. Makes sense, right? Pretty intuitive on that. But let's talk about a little bit of the difference, especially between grid sampling and zone sampling, because it seems like the roots of precision agriculture really were in soil fertility and soil sampling to try to figure out where the difference is for different soil constituents were across the field. So grid sampling. Grid sampling is this idea that you take a field and you divide it into grids. And each one of these grids gets considered as if it's its own field. So you pull about 10 to 15 cores per grid, send them in, get them analyzed. When you get that data back, you merge it with your grid, and you get a map for each one of those soil parameters that you soil sampled for. So as you can see, this phosphorus result, this potassium result, and the soil pH result, all 3 of those have extremely different maps. They look very different. That's because the soil sampling explains the variability in grids. Okay. Zones, on the other hand, the data explains the variability in the field. So you take different data layers and merge them all together. And then based on that, you end up with zones. So each one of those zones should be considered as if it were its own field. Okay. And so when we're making zones, we use a lot of different data layers to explain the variability in the fields. We use yield data, we use imagery, topography and elevation, and sometimes even salinity. Personally, when I am making zones for a customer, I try to have someplace between 3 to 6 years worth of either imagery or yield data going into that. I usually always consider topography data but I don't always incorporate it. It depends upon what the result is that's coming out. If I have salinity data, I will certainly consider that and merge that all together. This is something that's really important to think about. I'm aware of a number of different places that make zones. And sometimes when people are making zones, they pick out one satellite image from 1 year, and that's supposed to explain your variability in your field. When have we ever made good decisions agronomically for any field based in 1 year of data? When you get your test plot data back, you always want to have as many years worth of data as possible, right? Well, why would you explain your field variability with just one image from 1 year, right? So I always encourage people to use multiple years worth of data whenever possible. We're also going to talk about good yield data versus bad yield data coming down the pipe. It's not worth it to incorporate bad yield data. Just going to throw that out there, but we'll talk about the hows and the whats of that in a second. Another data layer that gets overlooked all the time that's critically important is the farmer himself. Farmers, okay, there's always the scenario where the farmer might be picking up a brand new piece of land and maybe they don't quite have that history. But by and far and away, the farmer himself has been going over that field for how many years? 5 to 50 to maybe more than that. Those farmers know where that variability is in the field. So if you make a zone map for a farmer, you should be able to walk up to him and say, Mr. Farmer, does this look like your field? And that farmer should be able to say, yes, that's exactly what it looks like. If you get that look from the farmer that kind of goes, I don't know, you better go back to the drawing table and take a look at it because it's not getting described very well. So I always like to put my zones in front of the farmer himself, and not everybody does that. Just be aware when you're working with a precision ag consultant. So grid versus zone soil sampling. I do kind of want to bring up a little bit of difference in that. By and far and away in our region in North Dakota, and as you move further west throughout the United States, we do a lot more zone sampling here than we do grid sampling. Although there are exceptions to every rule, and I am aware of some grid sampling happening. Okay, grids are a lot more expensive and labor intensive than zone sampling is. Okay. That previous fields that I showed you with the grids had 73 grids on it. So if you're pulling 10 to 15 cores, that's a lot of cores. When I normally soil sample that field, it has 5 zones on it. So that those 5 zones usually have about 15 cores. That's a lot less cores on a zone soil sample. Also, grids explain the non-mobile soil nutrients much better than the mobile nutrients. So your non-mobile nutrients being things like phosphorus, potassium, or soil parameters like soil pH. It'll describe those things quite well. Zones, on the other hand, handle nitrogen testing better and sulfur. Those are your soil mobile nutrients. And by the way, one of the big differences between grids and zones dealing with geography is that the Corn Belt states, by and far and away, have usually done more grids than we have zones, but they don't value their nitrogen test like we do here, okay, for a couple of reasons. This is some data that's out of Ag Vice Laboratories. We have this thing in North Dakota, in case you're not aware, called winter, and it's real winter, okay? Our soils freeze, and when our soils freeze, nitrogen cannot move through them. We also have another thing in North Dakota called drought. 2021 is not that far away in my mind, and even late last fall is not that far away in my mind. When we have dry soils, nitrogen does not move through the soil. And you can clearly see the value of our nitrogen soil test in the fall of the year. This bar right here is 2021. This is the residual nitrate following wheat in the 0 to 24 inch, 67 pounds, whereas in a more normal year with nitrogen testing, it's quite a bit lower. So our nitrogen test here has value. When you go to the Corn Belt states, their drought is not as extreme as it is here, and their soils do not freeze like it is here. So they don't have the same value for that. So they're primarily trying to identify their non-mobile nutrients. If you are setting up zones, usually you set up those zones, they're describing your field variability very well, and you use those for years to come. But there are times and places and reasons why you want to set up maybe a second set of zones to help you manage something. For example, iron chlorosis in soybeans. Okay, the agronomic drivers from the soil behind iron chlorosis in soybeans is quite a bit different than, for example, managing your nitrogen for your corn or for your wheat. Okay, and so having a separate set of zones just to manage iron chlorosis, not a bad idea. And I have done that for a number of clients. So think about why you're using those zones, what your goals are, and if you need to have a second set of zones for some kind of a reason. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to zones is when you have similar productivity levels in the field, but for different reasons. I've seen it done a number of times from different competitors where there's this ultimate algorithm. And this algorithm is going to take all of your data and put it all together, and they've got this formula, and it's going to throw you out your 3, 5, or 7 zone field, and that is going to be the ultimate answer for every field on your farm and every field on your farm and your farm. And it's going to be great because everybody's all the same size and one algorithm fits everyone. I myself take a little bit of umbrage with that from an agronomic perspective. I think every field is individual. I think every farm is individual. And when I'm creating zones, I look at it from that perspective. So when I'm creating zones for someone, I'm analyzing each one separately. Now, when we put these zones together, and I'm taking a look at a field, okay, this red zone right here is a low productivity area of the field. This red zone is a low productivity area of the field. The production is similar. You're probably going to be achieving similar yields in those areas, but for very different reasons. Now we're in the Doubles Lake area. I don't have to preach to the choir to you guys about sloughs. I know you understand them way better than a chick from Hillsborough does, but these red areas right here are saline areas by these sloughs. Okay, they're salty, they're wet. These low productivity areas up here are dry, sandy areas. So they're low productivity areas that drought out. So what we did is we actually separated out these blue zone or these salty areas so that they became their own zone because they're a salty area. So we can soil sample them and we can manage them differently. Same productivity levels, relatively speaking, but for very different reasons. If you're working with a precision agriculture consultant, you should be working with someone that can really try to adapt to those things. Another art in the world of precision agriculture is the prescription export. You can write the most beautiful fertilizer, seed, chemical, whatever you want, prescription, but unless you actually get it into the controller and it's working and actually variable rating, you have nothing. And don't raise your hand, but just think in the back of your mind, how many people here have had the most beautiful prescription? They're going out in the spring of the year, they're going to plant their crop, and they're sitting at the end of the tractor and they can't get the prescription to go. It's a beautiful day. Everybody wants to plant. They can't make it go, and there's rain in the forecast for tonight. It's a bad day. So my experience is when you write the prescription, it's just got to work. It's just got to work. And getting it into the actual fertilizer spreader or into the tractor can be an art. And there's a lot of things that are going on with that today. It isn't just getting all of these different controllers to read prescriptions, it's also sending it out over the cloud. We are now sending prescriptions through platforms like John Deere Operations Center and through Raven's Slingshot, which has actually been really exciting and has worked quite well. But if you're writing a prescription, you just have to know how not only it works at the computer in the actual tractor cab, but how it needs to go through that cloud platform. So I don't know if you've ever actually seen what a prescription looks like, but oftentimes when we're doing an export, we're working with a shapefile export. How many people actually know what a shapefile is? A shapefile actually contains all of these file types within it. The newer shapefile formats contain this PRJ or projection description, but at the very least, you always have to have that .shx, .shp, and .dbf file, and they have to be named exactly the same. Otherwise, the computer on the other end will not read it. But a shapefile is a vector file. It's lines, it's points. It's not that pretty map. This is actually what a shapefile looks like. So those check marks in there. And within each one of those grids is that 4600 rate that says, as that fertilizer spreader goes across the field, this is the rate that you need to apply right here. So again, here's our pretty 4600 map. Here's our shapefile over the top of it. In this instance, we are telling the computer that we want to apply the average rate that's in the center of that square, and that's what's going to get applied in that spot. So different controllers and different cloud platforms have limitations on things. This is something that when you're working with somebody, your precision agriculture consultant should be able to work with you on this. And you should know something about your controller, and you should be in communication with your tech guys about what your controllers need. So for example, I'm going to back up here. I forgot to tell you, each one of these squares is considered to be a polygon. Okay. And so in this particular thing, I've got like 15,600 and something polygons in here. Okay. So, but each one of the controllers can only take certain amounts. So like, for example, Case Pro 700 can only accept 500 polygons, and it can only think about 255 rates. So that's how many individual different rates you have for that. A Raven Viper Pro only allows 10,000 polygons. Well, I have actually broken that rule and gotten away with it, but be very, very careful if you do that. You get out of control with some of those polygon counts, and the computers almost like blow up. It's ridiculous. A Trimble Easy 250 only accepts 1,500 polygons. So when we have those beautiful prescription maps, we need to figure out how to adapt to all of that. And when we're sending our prescriptions over those cloud platforms, we need to keep them under 10,000 polygons. So just something to think about when you're setting up all of your prescriptions. What about decisions and data analysis? Well, I can tell you one thing, there's a million and one ways to think about how to answer questions with your agriculture data. So I'm just going to kind of throw some ideas out there. Feel free to ask questions, whatever. But the first thing that you always have to think about is, what question do you want to actually answer? Now, when I've worked with farmers in the past, many times they come to me and they say, I want to know how much money I made. Great, don't we all? Let's try to ask a better question, a lot more specific. Was there actually return on investment to the specific rate that I did? How did my crop perform on a VRT standpoint? So ask specific questions. And what do you actually need to analyze those zones? You need to have yield data and good yield data. We're going to talk about that now. And you need to have zones or some sort of way that describes your field variability, because we're going to try to figure out and answer questions based on the different areas of your field. So yield data. This is what a nice yield data map looks like. Isn't that pretty? This is what a bad yield map looks like. Okay, do you see how streaky this is? This is all about combine calibration, and this is actually one of the challenges that we face oftentimes and in our agricultural areas going all the way further west. As our farms get larger, we deal with multiple combines, and that combine calibration becomes more important. You have to have good combine calibration to bring things together. And when you calibrate, it's not just that average speed that's important. You need to have a high flow, a mid flow, and a slow flow calibration. Let me show you how important that is. So this is, I'm sorry if this is kind of small in the back, but this is what combine number 1 harvested in this field. And the minimum value for this combine was 22 bushels. And this is a wheat field, okay? So just to put things in perspective, the average yield was 89 bushels and the max was about 110. The second combine, going the wrong way. Okay, the second combine harvested 5 bushels to the acre for the minimum yield. When you're talking wheat, 5 to 22 bushels, that's a pretty big difference. Okay. The average was 80, 85. So the combine before was 89, and the max yield was 110. So what happens is you end up with this streakiness because one of those combines didn't slow down and do the slow flow calibration like it was supposed to, which is unfortunate. Now, when it comes to creating zones from something like this, there's no way that I can fix this and make zones out of it. You would not want zones made out of this because you would have variability out there that's describing the miscalibration between the combines, not variability that's in the field. If you really wanted to make decisions off of that, well, that's up to you, but you just have to be aware that that's how far off your yield data is. Okay, so individual zone analysis. There's so many things we can do when we want to take a look at data and really think about what we want to know about our fields. So we can actually take our zones and we can actually clip out just zones. You can take a look at each one of those zones as if it's its own field and understand that. So this is the big field, okay? And this is cornea from 2013, but realize all the prices and everything going forward from here, I'm putting in with 2022 values, okay? So this average, the field average was about 99 bushels. But when I take out just these dark green zones, the high productivity areas of the field, the average of those high productivity areas is 175. That's pretty valuable. You do that over a number of years, and you can really hone in what your yield goals should be for those different areas in the field. Pretty exciting. Revenue, of course, we always want to bring it down to dollars and cents. It's really easy to take yield data and just add in some prices and get some dollars in there. So you can see on a revenue basis, we made someplace between $247 and $1,200 to the acre on that field. I think I was using $757 for a sale price on the corn in here. Profit, all you do is add in your or subtract out what the cost is of your inputs. And you can do that in a variable rate standpoint or not. I went into the crop budget and just took a flat rate crop budget. This field is in Wells County. And so I used the East Central one and came up with a loss on the red areas of $12 to the acre. And in the purple areas, they're making about $950. So, but again, this was a flat rate. Hopefully we are managing our cost, especially with fertilizer. I mean, if we've got $600 or $800 or $1,000 urea, hopefully we don't get to $1,000 urea. But if we've got really expensive urea, we should be variable rating that and seeing a difference in that profit. Check strips. How many people want to understand if you implement something new, how should we evaluate that instead of a check strip? Oftentimes when I'm working with somebody that wants to use check strips for the first time, they always want to try to put them in the direction of the travel of like your planter. I'm going to recommend that you don't do that. And the reason for it is, even with RTK, usually your passes don't match up equally with your planter. It's really hard to make that work out. I've tried, and I've worked with some really precise people that have tried, and they've messed up some trials that way. So if you put it across the direction of travel and just write it into your prescription, you will always hit that change in the rate when you're applying it. When you're harvesting it, you will always hit that change of the rate. So from an application standpoint, this works a lot better. The other thing to keep in mind is each one of the zones that's in this field, we need to think about it as if it's its own field. So you want to know what the effect is in each one of those zones from that change. Because if you get a good benefit in your low productivity areas, well, then do that there. If you get a good benefit in your high productivity areas, do that there. But likewise, if you don't, well, don't write that into that zone for the future years, right? So in this example, all I did, I kept the integrity of the 4600 map that we've been looking at. And all I did was increase that rate by 50 pounds to the acre. And so here's my check strip going across. And then I just did some quick revenue stuff. And you can see that in our red zone areas, and I only have a cost in here for urea. I don't have total direct costs or anything. All I did was take revenue and subtract it out. But I think the cost of urea was, and I think I was using $680 a ton or something like that, just relatively speaking. But you can see that, basically we're losing about $64 an acre in these low productivity areas. But in the orange areas, we're making $10 to the acre. So you can think about that and decide whether you want to increase the rate from that standpoint. And you can use this check strip in any way you want, whether that's from, implementing fungicide. If you know where that check strip is, you can glean out that yield data. Productivity consistency. This is something I don't think we think a lot about. How consistent are the yields in your field? So we've partitioned out the variability in the field with zones, but how consistent is the yield within that zone? And that's an important thing to think about. So one of the things that we have as a proprietary product in our software is called confidence mapping. What it does is we put in a number of years worth of yield data, and from that we will get an average productivity map and a high productivity map. And then we also come out with a confidence map that says this is how confident that your field is going to yield like this in this spot. So for example, and the average yield on our productivity map is always thought of as 100%. So 100% is your average yield. And if you're over 100%, that's how much over your average yield you get. Or if it's less than that, that's that is. So here's an average productivity map that our software has created. And you can see that in these red zones, those saline areas, it's only going to yield about 45% of what that average yield is going to be. But in these dark purple areas, you're looking at 129%. So if you're working with a different crop, you can kind of set your yield goals based on that. But how confident are we that we're going to get that 45% of that yield in that spot consistently? Well, that's what this says. This confidence map tells us that in these dark purple areas, we're 98% sure that it's going to yield at that level year in and year out. What's interesting is in this map right here, you can see that there's a spot that it looks dark red. We're only 43% confident that we're going to be achieving this, 90% yield right there in that spot. And that is true. This field actually has a topography thing. It's like a side hill seep thing going on. It's really strange. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting deal. So things to keep in mind: use good yield data, ask specific questions. Your zones do need to be accurate. You always have to have accurate zones, and make sure your check strips go across the zones. Let's talk just a little bit about topography data. The productivity compared to a yield goal. What you could do is develop your yield goal from that. No, that is literally from your yield data. Yep, all the maps that you've got. So that that productivity map is literally a product of what your field has actually produced. Has nothing to do with yield goals. So it's real numbers that go in there. Okay, so drainage and drain tile planning. This is actually a really big part of our business, and managing water, kind of a big deal, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the accuracy of topography data. So first of all, LiDAR, what is it? It's light detection and ranging, and it's flown with planes. There is a near infrared pulse on this plane that is shot down to the ground, and there's receivers that receive the pulse back. That's a timing thing, and based on that time, we're able to determine what the elevation is. This is extremely accurate data. The first data set that was flown in the Red River Valley around the 2008 timeframe, had a 6-inch accuracy, which doesn't sound very impressive, but what I'm talking about is 6 inches from Wahpeton to Winnipeg. So from that, over that entire area. So it's extremely accurate. I've used a lot of that for making surface drainage maps. I've had a lot of happy customers with that. The Red River Valley was actually just flown again in 2020. So there is updated Red River Valley LiDAR data. It was just made available this summer. This is free data that's available. LiDAR does have some limitations though. It cannot penetrate water. It can't penetrate really heavy crop canopy. So if you've got cattails around your slough, that can be an issue. We'll try to cut that out. Rain, snow, clouds. So we do actually have a very limited time when we can fly. We don't really want to fly when there's crop growing out in the field either. RTK, and this is something that I think is really important for farmers to understand when they're out running their ditching tractors or gathering data. Because I can actually take RTK topography data and blend it back with LiDAR data or other sets of topography data to help update so that we can actually have updated topography data. It's very exciting stuff. You know, you can be quite a ways away from your base station with RTK. It still drives and still keep your rows straight, right? You can be quite a ways away. That is not true for your vertical accuracy. You need to be much closer to your base station to maintain that accuracy. So, my boss, Kelly Sharp, who also owns GK Technology, actually came up with this based on his experience working with topography data over the years. At 1 mile with RTK, you can expect about an inch, just under an inch of accuracy. 2 miles, about an inch and a half. 4 miles, 3 inches, 8 miles, 6 inches. So think about how far away you are from your base station, and then think about how accurate you need to have that. I will also throw out there, okay, I'm obviously from the Red River Valley. It is flat, okay? I like to joke, you guys out here at Devil's Lake, you have this thing called elevation. I realize that's a joke, but you have more elevation differences than what I have over by me. And so that does make a difference in how much accuracy you need when you're making topography maps. If you have more elevation, it's easier to make water flow. It flows downhill. It's not rocket science. But like I stated, I can take RTK data and actually blend that into LiDAR data and update it or really work with it so that you have some good data. When farmers want to log RTK data for topography, a lot of times they're using just data off of their regular field operations. And that can be good, but you need to think about what you're doing out there. For example, if you're combining and the combine gets full and it sinks down, and then you start the auger and it empties out, you know, that combine is going down and up. So that's an important thing to think about. The other thing is when you drive across the field, you're not necessarily catching all of the topography features that you need to catch. So one of the things that I've actually done is driven, it looks crazy, it totally gets the neighbors talking. So if you need to do that, try this. You put a base station up and you go out and log topography data and you just drive the topography features, your ditches. So you're just literally driving all over your field. It looks ridiculous. But you get good data off of those ditches, which is what you need. And then you can blend that back in to either your pass by pass data on a tillage tractor or something, or with LiDAR. So yeah, here's just a little, be close to your base station. So in closing, for everything in the entire presentation, you need to describe the variability in your field accurately. You need accurate zones. So either grids or zones. You need to get the prescription into the tractor. You can do a lot of different things analyzing data. And of course, make sure you get good topography data. The last thought that I really want to leave you with, precision agriculture is becoming such a complex world that it's really important to think about who you're working with as a precision agriculture consultant. I think it's going to be a whole new world of agronomy. And I really partition this out that you need to look for someone who's got 3 components. First of all, their agronomy knowledge. You need to understand how plants grow, why things work the way they do in the field. If you don't have somebody with agronomy background, who knows why you're making decisions out there. Equipment engineering, you need to understand how the equipment works. You can understand why things need to be done, but unless you understand how the equipment works and you can get it into the equipment, it isn't going to work. And then you have to have someone who understands the software component of it. How do you write stuff in the software? And if you have somebody with all 3 of those, you're going to be working with someone who really understands precision agriculture. Now, you can have places where 2 of the 3 will overlap and have some good things happening. For example, if you've got somebody who's got good background with equipment and understands software, you'll have auto steer, you'll have section control. We love those things. They work well. If you've got somebody who understands equipment and agronomy, you have the ability to BRT. That's a good thing. And if you've got somebody who understands the software component of it and the agronomy knowledge and how to run the data, you can really have someone that's creating good zones for you. But if you're missing part of this, you can really be missing some things too. So, for example, if you've got someone who only understands the software and computers and equipment, but they don't understand why you do things in the field, then you're getting prescriptions with rates that don't make sense in the field. So you're changing rates and doing things that don't make sense. You can have someone who understands equipment and agronomy, but not this side of it. And then you're getting non-calibrated yield data. This is one of my favorites. It's okay. The guy at the computer, they'll fix it. Well, no, the yield data that I showed you earlier today, that's junk. I can't fix that. There's no way I can fix that. And then if you've got somebody who understands the software side of it and the agronomy, you can come up with the most beautiful prescriptions. But again, if you can't get it into the equipment, you have nothing. So it's really important when you're working with somebody in precision agriculture that you're working with someone who has all 3 of those components. So with that, I'm going to say go Bison this weekend. That's one of my favorite, go Bison. I always listen to the Bison games when I'm out soil sampling. So there it is. Thank you very much for having me. I don't know if we even have time for questions. Oh, great. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. LiDAR? The LiDAR comes from a lot of free sources. In North Dakota, it has come from the Red River Basin. And if you want, if you go to the GK Technology website, we actually have the links to that on our website. In Minnesota, it's the DNR. But that is an excellent question. The question is, what is the value to implementing precision variable rate on your farming operation? And the truth of the matter is it's going to be that it depends, okay? Because it depends upon how much variability you've got in your farming operation. One of the things that I'll tell you, in the course of the last 2 years, there is a major uptick in interest that our company has seen for farmers because they are trying to manage the cost of their fertilizer, especially in this particular environment. And one of the things that we need to think about is, when I showed you return on investment, I had a flat rate cost going into there. That's not what we want to do with precision agriculture. We want to set our yield goals and our production potentials in areas in the field that are realistic. Okay. And so in those salty areas, unless you're doing something that is significantly changing the salt, don't put that kind of fertilizer, fertilize for what the real yield is in those low producing areas and reduce that. You may even want to, if there's a way to plant something different in those salinity areas, do that. Research actually has shown historically that by far and away, precision agriculture does not necessarily save the amount of fertilizer that's used. But what it has shown, and this is actually a USDA study published in 2007, But what it has shown is that farmers are more efficient with their fertilizer. Because what they've also found is that in the areas with greater yield potential, they're applying more fertilizer there. So they're probably getting better yields in the good areas, but they're also using less in the areas that don't warrant it. So